A man drowning in debt he never deserved. A woman with 7 hungry children, sitting on a frozen town square while good people walked right past. One rancher stops. One act of defiance against a town full of hollow prayers. But the woman he just saved is carrying a secret that could take everything he has left. Stay with me. Like, share, subscribe, and don't move an inch. And ends.
April in Texas wasn't supposed to freeze, but the wind howling through Oakhaven that noon had teeth. It bit through wool. It bit through bone. In the center of the town square, a woman sat on a battered wooden trunk. 7 children huddled around her like quail caught in a storm. They had just been turned out of the boarding house. The landlord had clicked the locks, shut the door, just like that. Folks walked by. Good. God-fearing folks? Reverend Miller pulled his heavy coat collar up and looked at the sky, suddenly fascinated by the gray clouds. Martha Higgins gathered her skirts tight. She scurried past them like poverty was a disease she might catch. Nobody stopped. Nobody offered a hand. Silas Vance pulled his wagon to a halt in front of the Mercantile. He was 44, tired. His shoulders were heavy with a massive bank debt he hadn't earned. The bank was breathing down his neck, threatening foreclosure on his ranch, the Broken Spur. He had his own problems, more than enough of them. But he looked at the kids. The smallest one, a little girl barely 3 years old, was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The oldest boy, maybe 16, stood tall trying to block the wind, trying to be a man when he was just a boy. Silas watched the townspeople step around the family. A knot of pure hot anger tightened in his chest. It tasted like ash. He didn't think about his empty wallet. He just stepped down from the wagon. His boots hit the frozen mud with a heavy, deliberate thud. He walked over. The whispering in the square stopped. Silas didn't lower his voice. He didn't care who heard him. You folks pray for mercy on Sunday, Silas' voice boomed, rattling the icy air. But you let children freeze to death on a Tuesday. Does your religion only live on the tip of your tongues? Silence, absolute. Suffocating silence fell over the square. Reverend Miller flushed a deep red. Martha Higgins gasped. Her hand flying to her chest. Silas didn't look at them anymore. They weren't worth the time. He turned his attention to the woman on the trunk. Her face was pale, proud, and frozen. She didn't look like a beggar. She looked like a survivor holding on by a thread. His voice softened. Just a fraction. Get in the wagon. All of you. They climbed in. No bags of gold. Just a few threadbare blankets. That old trunk. And a whole lot of quiet. Silas snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Oakhaven and its hollow prayers behind. The road back to High's Ramrackle Ranch was rough. The silence on the wagon was heavier than the wind. He needed to know who he was feeding. He didn't have much to offer. She had already pulled him aside at the wagon step, offering to clean, to cook, to mend for a miserable $4 a month. Dirt cheap, desperate. He looked over his shoulder. What's your name? She sat straight back on the hard wooden board. Her hands were folded tight in her lap. I'm Clara, she said softly. Then she took a breath and added the rest. Clara Montgomery. Silas' hands froze. The rough leather reins bit into his calloused palms. Montgomery. The name hit him like a physical blow to the gut. William Montgomery. The man he had once called a brother. The man who had begged Silas to co-sign a massive loan, only to die suddenly, leaving Silas to drown in a sea of debt. The man who had ruined his life. The wind howled through the barren trees. Silas stared at the dirt road ahead. He could stop the wagon. He could tell them to get out. Walk back to town. It would be fair. It would be justice of a sort. But behind him, he heard the little girl sneeze. He heard the rustle of fabric as the oldest boy took off his own thin jacket and wrapped it around his little brother's shoulders. The sins of the father. They didn't belong to the children. Man's dignity wasn't built on turning away the helpless, no matter the ghosts attached to their name. Silas loosened his white-knuckled grip on the reins. He gave a sharp, low whistle. The horses picked up the pace toward the broken spur. He didn't say a word. He just drove them home. Morning came to the broken spur like a reluctant guest, cold, gray. Peeking over the eastern ridge without an ounce of warmth, Silas woke before the sun. He always did. Habit was an iron chain, and he wore it every day. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot. The floorboards were freezing against his bare feet. He reached for his wool shirt. Stiff. Smelled like dust and yesterday. As sweat, he expected the house to be dead quiet. That was his normal. He expected the kitchen to be dark. He expected to light the stove with numb fingers, boil bitter coffee, and chew on tasteless oats. Survival wasn't supposed to taste good. It was just supposed to keep you upright. But as he walked down the narrow hall, he stopped. Warmth. It bled from the kitchen archway, and a smell. Bacon grease, toasted flour, real coffee. Silas stepped into the doorway. Clara was already at the stove. She wore a faded blue dress. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows. Her hands were covered in flour. She moved with quiet purpose. No wasted steps. 3 of the younger children sat at the heavy wooden table. They were quiet, too quiet. They watched Silas like cornered rabbits. Clara didn't turn around. She just slid a cast-iron skillet off the heat. "Coffee's ready," she said. Her voice was level. Not a servant's voice, a worker's voice. Silas didn't know what to say. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He walked to the cupboard, reached for his usual mug. It wasn't there. He paused. His eyes darted down. The mugs had been moved to the lower shelf, right next to the coffee tin. It made sense. It was efficient. It annoyed him instantly. He poured his coffee in silence. He took his plate to the far end of the table. The oats were different today, sweetened with a drop of molasses. Thick filling. He ate looking down at his plate. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't know how anymore. But he ate every last bite. When he stood up to leave for the barn, Clara finally looked at him. "I'll need lye soap for the wash," she said. "In the shed," Silas answered. Short, clipped. He walked out the door. The cold air hit his face. He took a deep breath. His house didn't feel like his house anymore. It felt alive. He wasn't sure he liked it. The barn smelled of hay and old manure. Familiar. Safe. Silas stoked the forge. He needed to shoe the gray gelding. The iron heated up, glowing dull orange, then bright cherry red. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil chased away the quiet. A shadow fell over the barn doors. Silas didn't stop hammering. He just shifted his eyes. James, the 16-year-old, the boy was skinny, too much wrist sticking out of his coat sleeves. He stood there, shifting his weight from boot to boot. Silas lowered the hammer. He looked at the boy. William Montgomery's son. The jawline was the same. It made Silas's stomach tighten, but the eyes were different. William's eyes had always been searching for an angle. James's eyes were just searching for a place to stand. "You need something, boy?" Silas asked. His voice was rough, like sandpaper. "I can help," James said. He didn't ask. He offered. Silas studied him. He could send him away. Tell him to go chop wood, keep him out of sight. But out on the frontier, a boy needed to know how to work a forge. It was the difference between walking and riding. Silas picked up a heavy rasp. He held it out. "You know how to clean a hoof?" Silas asked. James stepped forward, took the rasp. "I've seen it done." "Seeing ain't doing," Silas muttered. He led the gray gelding out of the stall. He picked up the horse's left hind leg, braced it between his knees. "Come here. Watch the angle." James moved in. He was nervous. Silas could smell the fear on him. The boy was waiting to be yelled at, waiting to be told he was useless. Silas knew that flinch. He'd seen it on raw recruits in the war. James took the hoof. He brought the rasp down. Too hard, too flat. The horse snorted and shifted its weight, tossing its head. James dropped the rasp. He took a fast step back. His shoulders hunched. He braced for the shout. He braced for the back of a hand. Silas stood still. He looked at the dropped tool. Then he looked at the boy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. "Pick it up," Silas said. Calm, steady. James blinked. He bent down, hands shaking slightly, and retrieved the rasp. Silas stepped behind him. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hands directly over the boy's thin ones. "You don't fight the hoof," Silas said softly. "You follow it. The horse tells you where the dead nail is. You just listen." With the iron, he guided the boy's hands. Smooth stroke, forward. Down, the angle was right this time. The horse relaxed. "Feel that?" Silas asked. "Yes, sir," James whispered. "Keep doing that." Silas stepped back. He let the boy work. He didn't praise him. He didn't need to. The respect was in the silence. It was in the space Silas gave him to learn without being broken. A man didn't grow by being chopped down. He grew by being shown how to stand. The day dragged on. Hard work. Honest work. Silas fixed the fence line. He rode the perimeter. When he came back to the house at dusk, his bones ached. He sat on the front porch. The sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding purple and gold across the Texas dirt. He pulled his boots off, wiggled his toes in the freezing air. The screen door creaked. Silas didn't turn his head. He heard the tiny, shuffling footsteps. Grace, the 3-year-old. She walked over to him. Her thumb was in her mouth. Her other hand was clutching something tight to her chest. She stopped right beside his chair. Silas looked down. She looked up, big round eyes. No fear, just curiosity. She pulled her thumb out of her mouth. She extended her small, chubby hand. In her palm rested a square of golden cornbread, still warm, smelled like butter. Silas stared at it. Nobody had handed him anything, just for the sake of handing it to him in 6 long years. Everything had a price. Everything had an interest rate. "For you," Grace chirped. Silas hesitated. His throat felt thick. He reached out with a scarred, dirty hand. He took the cornbread. His rough fingers brushed against her soft palm. "Thank you," he rumbled. Barely a whisper. Grace smiled. She turned around and waddled back inside. Silas sat there in the fading light. He looked at the cornbread. He took a bite. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He closed his eyes. The fortress he had built around his chest over the last 6 years cracked. Just a fraction, but it cracked. The mud in the corral was thick. Suck your boots off thick. A late spring thaw had turned the ground into a brown, churning soup. Silas stood knee-deep in it. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a filthy leather glove. He was breathing hard. Cornered against the split-rail fence was a red roan heifer. She was young, wild, and sick. Silas had noticed it at dawn. Her head was low. Her breathing was ragged. She needed a dose of medicine, or she'd be dead by tomorrow. He couldn't afford to lose a single head of cattle. The bank was counting his herd in their ledgers. Every cow was a month of borrowed time. But a sick cow isn't a weak cow. Panic makes them strong. Silas had a rope around her neck. He had the syringe clamped in his teeth. He pulled. The heifer planted her hooves in the muck and threw her head back. "Come on, girl," Silas grunted. He wrapped the slack around his waist and leaned back. The heifer bawled. She lunged forward, then thrashed violently to the side. The mud betrayed him. Silas's left boot slipped. He went down hard on one knee. The rope burned right through his heavy gloves. The heifer jerked free of his grip, kicking up a shower of foul mud straight into his face. Silas spat dirt. He stayed on one knee for a second, exhausted. He needed another man. He needed someone to hold the line while he administered the dose. But he was alone. He was always alone. He grabbed the rope again. He braced his legs, ready to lose the fight, but refusing to quit. Then, a splash. Heavy footsteps in the muck behind him. Silas turned his head. Clara was climbing over the wooden fence. She didn't hesitate. She hit the mud with a wet slap. Her blue cotton dress instantly soaked up the brown sludge. The hem dragged in the filth. "What are you doing?" Silas barked. "Get back in the house." Clara ignored him. She waded through the knee-deep muck. Her face was set in stone. She didn't flinch at the smell. She didn't tiptoe. She reached out and grabbed the thick hemp rope just behind Silas' hands. "Pull," she ordered. Silas stared at her. "She'll kick you clean in half. Go back." "If she dies, we starve," Clara said flatly. She wrapped the rope around her forearms. She dug her boots deep into the mud. "I said, pull, Silas." He didn't have the breath to argue. The heifer lunged again. "Now," Clara shouted. They hauled back together. Clara wasn't heavy, but she was anchored. She threw her entire body weight backward. The rope snapped taut. The heifer thrashed, throwing her massive head wildly. Mud flew everywhere. It splattered across Clara's face. It matted her hair. She didn't let go. She didn't scream. She held the line with a stubborn, terrifying strength. "Hold her," Silas yelled. He let go of his end with one hand. He grabbed the glass syringe from his coat pocket. He lunged forward through the mud. The cow kicked. A hoof grazed Silas's thigh, leaving a bruise that would last weeks. He ignored it. He grabbed the thick hide of the cow's neck. He jammed the needle in, pushed the plunger down. "Done! Let go!" Silas shouted. Clara released the rope. The heifer stumbled backward, shook her head furiously, and trotted off to the far corner of the pen, defeated and medicated. Silas stood up straight. His chest was heaving. He looked at Clara. She was covered head to toe in brown muck. Her hands were raw red from the rope. Her breathing was fast and shallow, but she stood tall. They didn't speak. They just waded out of the pen, their boots making loud sucking sounds with every step. They walked to the iron hand pump near the trough. Silas grabbed at the handle. He pumped it hard. Cold, clear water gushed out. Clara stepped under it. She held her raw hands out. The water washed away the mud and the tiny streaks of blood from the rope burns. Silas pumped the water in silence. He watched the dirt wash away. He realized something then. She hadn't come out to prove a point. She had come out because there was work, and the work didn't care who did it. He stepped up to the pump next. Clara took the heavy iron handle. She pumped the water for him. He scrubbed his face. The cold water shocked his system, but it felt good. They were standing there, dripping wet and shivering when the sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Sheriff Amos Decker rode into the yard. His badge caught the morning light. His horse was brushed clean. Amos sat tall in the saddle, a man who liked the sound of his own authority. He pulled his horse to a stop. He looked down at Silas. Then his eyes slid over to Clara. He took in her ruined dress, the mud in her hair, the dirt on her face. Amos frowned. He tipped his hat back. "Morning, Silas," Amos drawled. Then he clicked his tongue, a sound full of pity. "Ma'am, it's a shame to see a lady in such a state. Silas, you ought to be ashamed. A woman belongs inside, tending the hearth. Muck and manure ain't fit for a lady's constitution. It ain't right." Amos smiled. He thought he was being a gentleman. He thought he was being chivalrous. Silas felt his jaw tighten. He stepped forward to tell Amos to mind his own damn business. But Clara stepped past him. She didn't try to wipe the dirt off her face. She didn't try to hide her soiled dress. She walked right up to the sheriff's gleaming horse and looked Amos dead in the eye. "Sheriff Decker," Clara said. Her voice rang clear across the yard. Not loud, but it cut through the air like a honed knife. Amos looked down, still holding that patronizing smile. "Yes, ma'am. Equality isn't just splitting the pie at the dinner table, Sheriff," Clara said, her words measured and absolute. "It's sharing the mud when times are hard." Amos's smile vanished. He blinked, taken aback. "Women aren't made of," Clara continued, her chin lifting higher. "We bleed the same red blood, and we sweat the same salt. The ground doesn't care if a man or a woman works it. It only cares about the sweat you pour into it. My constitution is just fine. Keep your pity for someone who needs it." She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the house. Her head was high. Her back was straight. Amos sat frozen in the saddle. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Silas, expecting the rancher to apologize for the woman's outburst. Silas didn't apologize. He stood by the water pump, watching Clara's retreating back. A slow, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Silas's mouth. The first real smile he had felt in 6 years. He looked back at the sheriff. "You heard the lady, Amos," Silas said quietly. "Now, state your business or get off my land." Thaddeus Blackwood didn't ride a horse. He drove a black buggy with red-spoked wheels. It rolled into the yard of the Broken Spur on a Tuesday afternoon. The springs squeaked. The horse looked expensive. Thaddeus stepped down. He wore a gray suit, no dust on it. He always looked clean. That was the thing about bankers. They let other men dig in the dirt. Silas was at the chopping block, an axe in his hand. Wood chips scattered around his boots. He watched Thaddeus walk up. He didn't lower the axe. "Afternoon, Silas," Thaddeus said. His voice was smooth, like oiled glass. "Thaddeus," Silas swung the axe. It split a log clean in two. The crack echoed across the yard. "I am not here to twist your arm," Thaddeus said. He stood a safe distance from the flying wood. "I am here to offer a way out, a clean slate." Silas leaned on the axe handle. He breathed in the scent of split pine. "I am listening." Thaddeus pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket. 80 acres, the south pasture, the plot with the creek running through it. Sell it back to the bank. Market price. I wipe your debt clean. You keep the house. You keep the upper 40 acres. It sounded fair. To a stranger, it sounded like a blessing. But Silas knew the land. The upper 40 acres were dry, rocky, good for nothing but rattlesnakes and sagebrush. The creek was the lifeblood of the Broken Spur. Without that water, the herd would die in the August heat. Without that water, the land was a corpse waiting to rot. Thaddeus wasn't offering salvation. He was offering a slow death instead of a quick one. "No," Silas said. Thaddeus frowned. A small, polite frown. "Be reasonable, Silas, you drowning. William Montgomery pulled you under, and you still holding his anchor. Let the 80 acres go. Start fresh." "A ranch without water is just a graveyard," Silas said. "I'm not selling." "You have 30 days, Thaddeus said quietly. The polite tone slipped. The steel underneath showed. Then the bank takes it all. The creek, the house, the dirt under your boots. Think about it." Thaddeus tipped his hat. He climbed back into his black buggy. The red wheels spun, kicking up dust as he drove away. Silas stood in the yard. His grip on the axe handle was white-knuckled. He didn't know the kitchen window was open. He didn't know Clara had heard every word. An hour later, another visitor arrived. Martha Higgins walked up the drive. She carried a woven basket, covered with a checkered cloth. She marched with the stiff-backed posture of a woman carrying the weight of the town's morality on her shoulders. Clara was on the porch, mending a torn shirt. She looked up. She didn't smile. She just waited. Martha stopped at the bottom step. She held the basket out. "Charity," Martha announced. Her voice was loud, mean to be heard. "Some old clothes. For the children. The good Lord teaches us to pity the unfortunate." Clara stood up. She set the sewing down. She walked to the edge of the porch. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Clara said. Her tone was perfectly flat. Martha didn't hand the basket over right away. Her eyes darted toward the open front door, looking for Silas, looking for scandal. "It's a heavy burden, Mrs. Montgomery," Martha said. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a whisper designed to carry, raising 7 children alone. But a widow's reputation is a fragile thing, living under the roof of an unmarried man. Well, people talk. It sets a terrible example for your daughters. It is frankly immoral. Silas was just inside the hallway. He had just taken his boots off. He froze. His blood ran hot. He took a step toward the door, ready to throw the woman off his property. But Clara's voice stopped him. "Immoral, Mrs. Higgins?" Clara asked. "Soft, steady. Living in sin," Martha hissed, clutching her shawl tight. "I see," Clara said. She walked down the steps. She stood on the same level as the town gossip. She didn't shrink. She didn't yell. "My children have a roof," Clara said, her voice clear as a struck bell. "They go to sleep with food in their stomachs. The man of this house treats them with respect. He works from dark to dark to keep the bank away." Clara took a step closer. Martha leaned back, suddenly looking small. "True immorality, Mrs. Higgins, is watching children freeze in the town square and turning your back because it might dirty your dress," Clara said. "My morality is measured by the safety of my children, not by the bored whispers of a town with too much time on its hands." "Keep your basket." Clara turned around. She walked back up the stairs. She picked up her sewing. Martha stood there. Her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. She turned sharply and marched away, her face flushed with outrage. Inside the hallway, Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He stepped back into the shadows. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She had fought her own battle, and she had won. Night fell over the Texas plains. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Silas sat at his desk in the corner of the front room. An oil lamp burned low. On the desk sat the foreclosure notice from Thaddeus Blackwood. 30 days. The words stared up at him, mocking him. He rubbed his eyes. He was tired. A deep bone, aching tired that sleep couldn't fix. He had kept the land today. But tomorrow the fight would start all over again. He heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. A steaming tin cup was placed on the corner of the desk. Black coffee. Hot. Clara stood there. For a moment, she looked at the foreclosure notice. She saw the numbers. She saw the 30-day stamp. She didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap. She didn't offer advice. She simply reached out and lightly tapped the edge of the desk twice. A steady, quiet rhythm. "I see you. I am here." Then she turned and walked back to the kitchen. Silas picked up the cup. The heat warmed his calloused hands. He took a sip. The coffee was bitter and strong, just the way he needed it. He looked at the empty doorway. A silent wall had been built today. Not a wall to keep people out. A wall to keep the two of them safe from the wolves circling the property line. The barn attic was a tomb of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight piercing through the roof slats. The air smelled of dry rot and old leather. Silas was looking for an extra block and tackle. He needed it to hoist hay bales before the rains came. He moved a broken saddle. He shoved aside a crate of rusted horseshoes. Behind a stack of moldy canvas, he found a small tin box. It was heavy. The latch was rusted shut. Silas pried it open with his thumb. The hinge snapped with a sharp crack. Inside lay a stack of yellowed papers, receipts, old grain bills, things he had thrown up here years ago and forgotten. He sifted through them, looking for the hardware receipt to see where he might have left the tackle. Near the bottom, his fingers brushed against a thick folded parchment. It wasn't a receipt. It had an official seal, faded red wax. Silas pulled it out. He carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The ink was brown with age, written in a sweeping formal hand. It was a land deed. Dated September 14, 1869. Silas's eyes scanned the heavy cursive. It detailed the exact coordinates of the broken spur ranch, the acreage, the creek line. It was the deed for the land he stood on. But it wasn't his name on the paper, and it wasn't the bank's. Silas read the names of the original purchasers at the bottom. Eleanor and James Montgomery. Silas stopped breathing. The silence in the attic roared in his ears. Montgomery, William's grandparents. Silas lowered the paper. His mind raced. William had come to him 6 years ago, spinning a story about a massive cattle expansion. He needed a cosigner. He needed capital to buy prime grazing land out west. But William hadn't been expanding. He had been buying back his family's lost ancestral land, and he had used Silas's name, Silas's credit, and Silas's sweat to do it. William knew the risks. He knew the soil was tough. He knew the bank would prey on them, and he had let Silas take the fall when the heart gave out in his chest. Silas stared at the dust floating in the sunbeam. He had bled for this dirt. He had starved for it, and all along he was just a tenant paying the blood price for another man's ghost. He folded the deed. He put it in his shirt pocket. It felt like a stone against his chest. He climbed down the ladder. The barn felt suffocating. He needed air. He walked out into the yard, toward the house. He opened the front door. The house was quiet. Clara was out back, hanging laundry on the line. In the parlor, the twin boys, Jacob and John, were playing with carved wooden blocks on the rug. They were chasing each other on their knees, laughing. John scrambled backward. His heel hit the leg of a small end table. The table rocked. Clara's sewing box, resting on top, slid off the edge. It hit the floorboards with a clatter. Spools of thread, needles, and scraps of fabric spilled everywhere. The boys froze. Their eyes went wide. They looked at the mess, then at Silas standing in the doorway. "Sorry, Mr. Vance," Jacob whirled. Silas sighed. The anger in his chest was for a dead man, not these boys. "It's all right," Silas said quietly. He walked over and knelt on the rug. "Help me pick it up before your mother sees." They scrambled to gather the spools. Silas reached for the wooden box. The impact had knocked the inner lining loose. A false bottom, made of thin cedar, had popped out of its groove. Underneath the false bottom lay a folded piece of heavy bank paper. Silas picked it up. He didn't mean to pry. He thought it was a fabric pattern. He opened it. It was a bank draft, issued from the First National Bank of Fort Worth. The ink was fresh, paid to the order of Clara Montgomery. Amount, $800. Silas stared at the numbers. 800. $800. That was a fortune. It was enough to buy a house in town, enough to buy a small herd, enough to feed 7 children for 5 years without breaking a sweat. Silas looked up. Clara was walking past the window, carrying an empty laundry basket. She looked tired. Her hands were raw. She was working for him, scrubbing floors, cooking meals, mending his torn shirts, all for $4 a month. Silas slowly folded the bank draft. He slipped it back under the false cedar bottom. He pressed the lining back into place. He stood up. He walked out the front door and kept walking until he reached the far fence line. He leaned against a post. He looked out over the dry, cracked earth. The pieces fell into place in his mind. Cold, hard, ugly. She had the deed to her family's land waiting in the shadows. She had $800 hidden in a sewing box, and she had arrived at the exact moment the bank was ready to foreclose on him. Why work as a servant when you hold the gold? Unless you are waiting for the current owner to fail. Unless you are waiting for the bank to take the land, so you can walk in with your hidden fortune and buy back your family's legacy for pennies on the dollar. Silas gripped the fence wire. The barbs bit through his leather gloves. He didn't feel it. He had started to trust her. He had started to look forward to the smell of coffee in the morning. He had fought the town sheriff for her dignity. He had taken her children in, and she was playing him, just like William had. A bitter wind blew across the plains. Silas pulled his hat down low over his eyes. He had learned a long time ago that the frontier didn't reward soft hearts. It buried them. He wouldn't confront her. Not yet. He would wait. He would watch. He would see just how deep the lie went. But the warmth that had started to grow in his house was gone. The cold had returned. And this time it came from the inside out. May in Texas is a liar. It promises spring but delivers the devil. The air had been heavy all afternoon, thick, hard to breathe. The sky turned the color of an old bruise by dusk. Silas watched the horizon. He knew that color. Every rancher knew it. He didn't sleep. He sat on the porch watching, waiting. At midnight, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a single breath. Then came the sound. It didn't start as rain. It started as a low, rumbling roar, like a freight train rushing across the open plains. Ice. The first stone hit the tin roof of the porch. It sounded like a gunshot. A second later, the sky opened up. Millions of jagged white stones poured from the black sky. They weren't small. They were the size of walnuts, some as big as peaches. They hammered the dry earth. They shredded the young leaves on the oak trees. Silas stood up. He looked out toward the east field, his wheat, the winter wheat. It was the only crop he had left to sell. It was the money he needed to hold the bank off for one more season. He couldn't see the field in the dark, but he could hear the ice tearing the stalks to ribbons. Gone. All of it. In 60 seconds, a sharp, terrifying crack echoed from the yard. Silas snapped his head toward the barn. The old roof. He had patched it, but the wood was rotting. The weight of the ice was piling up fast. A terrified whinny cut through the roar of the storm. The horses. Silas didn't grab a coat, he just ran. He hit the yard, and the hail battered him. It struck his shoulders, his arms, his face. It stung like buckshot. He threw his arms over his head and kept running. The ground was already slick with meltings and fresh mud. He reached the barn doors and heaved them open. Inside was chaos. The center beam of the roof was bowing. A massive section of shingles and rotted wood had already caved in, dumping a mountain of ice into the center aisle. The three horses were panicked. They were kicking at their stalls. Wood splintered. Eyes rolled white in the lantern light. If they broke their legs, they were dead. If the roof came down, they were dead. Silas grabbed a lead rope. He rushed the nearest stall. The gray gelding was rearing up, its hooves smashing against the gate. "Easy," Silas roared over the storm. "Easy, boy." He managed to get the rope unlatched. He dragged the heavy wooden door open. The horse lunged forward, nearly knocking Silas into the dirt. Silas dug his boots in, pulling down hard on the halter. He needed to get them out. Out to the open corral where falling beams couldn't crush them. But he was one man, three terrified horses, a roof groaning, like a dying do-it-alone. The barn doors swung wide again. Wind and ice blew inside. Silas turned his head, bracing for the worst. It was Clara. She had an oil lantern in one hand. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her nightgown was soaked, clinging to her skin. Over it, she wore a heavy canvas coat. Behind her, pale but determined, stood 16-year-old James. Silas stared. "Get back in the house. The roof is coming down." Clara didn't blink. She handed the lantern to James. She grabbed a spare lead rope off the wall. "Take the gray," Clara shouted to James. "Get him to the south pen. Stay away from the trees." James nodded. He grabbed the gelding's halter from Silas. The boy was scared, but he didn't run. He clicked his tongue, calming the beast, and let it out into the freezing storm. Clara ran to the next stall, a wild-eyed mare. "Clara," Silas yelled, moving toward her. "Get the roan," she ordered. She didn't look at him. She slipped into the stall with the mare. She didn't use force. She used a low, steady voice. She ran her hands down the horse's trembling neck. She slipped the halter on smoothly. Silas didn't argue. There was no time for pride. He ran to the last stall. They worked together, in the noise, in the cold. The barn groaned above them, raining dust and splinters. They dragged the last two horses out into the pounding hail. They fought the mud. They fought the wind. They secured the gates of the open corral. By the time the storm finally broke, an hour later, the yard was covered in a thick blanket of jagged white ice. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas stood by the corral fence. He was soaked to the bone. Blood trickled from a cut on his cheek where a hailstone had caught him. His hands were numb. He looked toward the east field. The rising moon cast a cold silver light over the land. The wheat was flattened, mashed into the mud. It looked like a graveyard. The fight was over. The bank had won. Silas had poured his blood into this dirt for 6 years, and the sky had wiped it out in an hour. His knees suddenly felt weak. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching void. He walked slowly back to the barn. He didn't go inside. He couldn't look at the collapsed roof. He just slumped against the outside wall. He slid down until he was sitting in the cold mud. He pulled his knees up. He rested his heavy head on his arms. He didn't cry. He was too tired for tears. He just shut his eyes and waited for the morning to come and take it all away. He fell asleep like that, sitting in the ruin of his life. Sometime later, the cold receded, just a little. Silas didn't wake up fully, but he felt a heavy, dry warmth settle over his shivering shoulders. It smelled like cedar and old wool. He opened his eyes, just a slit. Clara was standing over him. She had brought a heavy quilt from the house. She didn't say a word. She didn't offer empty comforts. "It will be all right" was a lie, and they both knew it. She tucked the corners of the quilt around his shoulders to keep the wind out. Her knuckles brushed his cold neck, a gentle, fleeting touch. Then she sat down in the mud next to him. She pulled her coat tight. She leaned her head back against the barn wall. She didn't look at him. She just looked at the ruined fields under the moonlight. They sat in silence. Silas closed his eyes again. The anger and suspicion he had felt yesterday melted away in the quiet dark. A person who was just waiting for you to fail didn't sit in the mud with you after the sky fell. They shared the loss, equal partners in the ruins. The morning sun was cruel. It melted the ice and turned the world into a steaming brown swamp. Silas stood in the kitchen. The warmth of the night before was gone. The harsh light of day brought the facts back to him. The wheat was gone. The roof was gone. Thaddeus Blackwood would be here by the end of the week, and the $800 was still sitting in the sewing box. Clara was at the stove, frying bacon, making coffee, acting like the world hadn't just ended. Silas walked into the room. He didn't sit down at the table. "Stop cooking," Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an anvil. Clara paused. She set the iron spatula down. She turned around. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him. She saw the deadness in his eyes. "The crop is gone, Silas," she said softly. "But the children still need to eat, and so do you." "I don't want your pity," Silas said. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out the folded, yellowed parchment. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. It landed with a soft, heavy slap. Clara looked at the paper. She didn't reach for it. She knew what it was. "I found it in the attic," Silas said. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor of deep hurt underneath. "Your husband's family deed, September 1869. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. A slow breath escaped her lips. "And I knocked over your sewing box yesterday," Silas continued. The words tasted like ash. The false bottom broke. "I saw the bank draft. $800. The kitchen was dead silent. Only the crackle of the bacon grease broke the quiet. Silas stepped closer to the table. "You have enough money to buy this place twice over. You have the ancestral claim. So tell me, Clara, were you just waiting? Did you come here to watch me sweat and bleed until I broke? Was working for $4 a month just a front until the bank kicked me off your family's dirt?" Clara looked up. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She walked past him. She went into the front parlor. Silas followed her, his jaw set tight. She knelt by her old wooden trunk. She unlocked it with a small brass key. She dug beneath the neatly folded clothes and pulled out a single sealed envelope. She stood up. She walked back to Silas. She held the envelope out. "Read it," she said. Silas hesitated. He looked at her eyes. There was no deceit in them, only a deep, tired sorrow. He took the envelope. He broke the seal. He unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was weak, shaky. The ink was faded, but Silas recognized the script instantly. "William." "Clara," the letter began. "If you are reading this, my heart finally gave out. I am leaving you with nothing but a mess, and for that, I beg God's forgiveness. But there is a heavier sin on my soul. The land in Oakhaven, the broken spur. I lied to Silas. I told him the loan was for a cattle expansion. It wasn't. It was the exact amount I needed to buy back my grandfather's acreage. I knew the soil was poor. I knew the bank terms were a trap, but I wanted the land back more than I wanted my honor. Silas was the only man honest enough and foolish enough to trust me without reading the fine print. I used him as a shield. Now I am dead, and the bank will crush him. I have ruined a good man to satisfy my own pride. There is an $800 life policy attached to this letter. Do not use it to pay my debts. They are too large. Take the children. Go east. Start over. Do not look back." "William," Silas stopped reading. The paper trembled in his calloused hands. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, poisonous. 6 years. He had defended William's name in town. He had punched a man in a saloon for calling William a fool. He had taken the debt, lost his own dreams, and lived like a dog because he thought he was honoring a brother who had simply caught a bad break. It wasn't bad luck. It was an ambush by his best friend. Silas let the letter fall to the floor. He leaned a heavy hand against the doorframe. He felt sick. Clara watched him. Her heart broke for the man standing in front of her. "I found the letter 3 weeks after he died," Clara said softly. "The bank draft came with it." Silas didn't look up. "Why didn't you just use it to pay off the bank? Why come here? Why scrub my floors?" Clara stood taller. Her voice lost its softness. It became iron. "Because it is blood money," Clara said. Silas finally looked at her. "William stole 6 years of your life to buy that money," Clara said, pointing a finger at the sewing box in the other room. "If I used it to buy a house, or buy cattle, or even pay off your debt, to make myself feel better. I would be making peace with his sin. I would be saying that what he did to you was acceptable, as long as it paid the bills in the end. She took a step toward him. I have 7 children watching every move I make, Silas, Clara said fiercely. I will not let my sons grow up thinking that deceit is an acceptable price for survival. I will not let my daughters think that human dignity can be bought with money stolen from a good man. Silas stared at her. So why come here? He asked, his voice cracking. Because William's debt isn't just money. It's labor, it's sweat, it's time, Clara said. I came here to work because working for you was the only honest way I could look you in the eye. I wanted to help you save the land that my husband tried to steal from you. She looked away. A profound sadness settled over her face. But I see now, she whispered. I was wrong to come. Clara, every time you look at my children, Silas, you see William, she said. She wasn't angry. She was just stating a tragic fact. Every time you look at me, you see the lie that ruined your life. My presence here doesn't heal you. It just keeps the wound open. She turned around. James, she called out toward the back hallway. The 16-year-old stepped out of the shadows. He had been listening. His face was pale. Get the trunk, Clara said quietly. Hitch the horses to the wagon. Ma, James started. Do it, James, Clara said. Her voice broke. Just a little, but she held firm. Silas didn't stop them. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the ghost of William Montgomery. The betrayal was too fresh. It demanded all the space in the room. An hour later, the wagon was loaded. The sun was burning hot, baking the mud in the yard. Clara climbed onto the buckboard. She gathered the reins. The children sat in the back, quiet and solemn. Little Grace was holding a piece of carved wood Silas had given her. She looked confused. Silas stood on the porch. He watched them. Clara looked at him one last time. She didn't wave. She gave him a slow, respectful nod. Goodbye, Silas, she said. Goodbye, Clara, he rasped. She snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting deep tracks into the wet earth. Silas stood on the porch until the wagon disappeared over the far ridge, until the sound of the wheels faded into the wind. He was entirely alone again. He had his truth. He knew the whole story. But as he looked out at his ruined fields and the empty yard and the quiet house, the truth felt infinitely worse than the lie. The silence she left behind was louder than the hailstorm. Silas sat at the kitchen table. The coffee in his mug was stone cold. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the empty chairs. Through the window, he could see the wagon tracks baked into the dried mud of the yard. They pointed east, toward town, toward away. In the center of the table sat a small leather pouch. Inside was $340. It was every uncrumpled bill and silver coin he had to his name. It was the money he had scraped together, dollar by bleeding dollar, to hold off Thaddeus Blackwood for one more month. He looked at the pouch. He looked out the window at the collapsed barn roof. The anger was still there, a hot, tight knot in his chest. William Montgomery had played him for a fool, used him like a rented mule. But as the sun climbed higher, baking the Texas dirt, the anger started to shift. It stopped aiming at the ghost of his dead friend. It started aiming at himself. He was letting the ghost win. He was sitting in an empty house, staring at a bag of money that belonged to the bank, waiting to be put out of his misery. Silas stood up. The chair scraped loud against the floorboards. He grabbed the leather pouch. He shoved it into his pocket. He walked out the front door and didn't look back. He didn't ride to the bank. He hitched the gray gelding to the flatbed wagon. He drove into Oakhaven. He bypassed the bank's brick building entirely. He pulled the wagon up to Miller's lumber yard. Old Man Miller came out, wiping sawdust off his canvas apron. He looked at Silas. He looked at the hard set of Silas' jaw. Silas? Miller nodded. Heard about the hail. Nasty piece of sky. I need lumber, Silas said. Pine planks, heavy crossbeams, 2 kegs of 10-penny nails. Miller raised an eyebrow. He knew about the foreclosure. The whole town knew. Silas, you fixing a barn for the bank to take next week? Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the leather pouch. He dropped it on the heavy oak counter. It clinked solid and heavy. I'm fixing my barn, Silas said. Load the wood. He spent the next 3 days in the sky. He tore down the shattered, rotting timber of the collapsed roof. He worked from first light until he couldn't see the hammer in his hand. He didn't eat much. He didn't stop to rest. He just swung the hammer. Crack. William's lies. Crack. The bank's threats. Crack. The empty house. The physical labor was brutal. His shoulders screamed. His knuckles bled. But with every nail he drove into the fresh pine, the poison bled out of him. He realized something up on that roof. Grief wasn't something you could outrun. It wasn't something you could drink away, or sleep away, or wish away. You had to work it through your bones. You had to build something heavier than the sorrow to crush it out of you. And as he worked Claras, words echoed in his head, over the sound of the hammer. I will not let my children grow up. Thinking deceit is an acceptable price for survival. He had been so blind. He had looked at her and seen William's shadow. He should have seen the light cutting through it. William was a man who used people to build his foundation. Clara was a woman who scrubbed a stranger's floor for pennies just to keep her conscience clean. She wasn't the disease. She was the cure. And he had let her walk away because he was too busy feeling sorry for himself. By the evening of the 3rd day, the roof was finished. It was strong, solid. It smelled of fresh sap and hard work. It would hold up against the wind. It would keep the horses dry. Silas climbed down the ladder. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his muscles. But his mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in 6 years. He walked into the house. He washed his hands at the pump. He went to his desk and pulled out a blank piece of paper. He picked up a pencil. He didn't write a love letter. He didn't write an apology begging her to come back. A woman like Clara didn't need a man on his knees. She needed a man who could stand upright beside her. He wrote 3 short sentences. The land is still here. The work isn't done. The choice is yours. He folded the paper. He put his hat on. He rode into Oakhaven the next morning. He didn't go to the boarding house. He went to the livery stable. James was there. The 16-year-old was mucking out a stall, shoveling manure to earn a few coins for his family. The boy looked up when Silas's shadow fell over the stall door. James tensed, gripping the pitchfork tight. Silas didn't step inside. He didn't tower over the boy. He leaned on the half-door, keeping himself level. You do good work, James, Silas said quietly. James blinked. He lowered the pitchfork a fraction. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Silas pulled the folded piece of paper from his pocket. He held it out. I need a favor. Man to man, Silas said. James stepped forward. He took the paper. He looked at Silas, waiting for the catch. You give this to your mother, Silas told him. His voice was steady, respectful. You don't tell her to read it. You don't tell her what to do. You just hand it to her. Whatever she decides, that's the end of it. Silas stepped back from the door. He tipped his hat to the boy, a gesture of equality. He turned and walked back to his horse. He rode back to the broken spur. He had done all he could do. He had fixed the roof. He had set the table. He had left the door unlocked. Now he just had to wait. And if she didn't come, he would face Thaddeus Blackwood tomorrow, standing on his own 2 feet, under a roof he had built with his own 2 hands. He was not a victim anymore. Friday morning, the deadline. The sun beat down on the broken spur without an ounce of mercy. Heat waves shimmered off the dry earth. Silas was in the yard. He was greasing the axle of his flatbed wagon. He wore his heavy work pants and a faded cotton shirt, sleeves rolled up over his scarred forearms. He wasn't hiding in the house, waiting for the executioner. He was working. He heard the sound of wheels on the dirt road. He didn't look up right away. He kept his hands on the heavy iron wrench. He tightened the nut on the axle. He braced himself for Thaddeus Blackwood's slick voice. He braced himself to lose the land. But the rhythm of the wheels was wrong. It wasn't the light, fast spin of a banker's buggy. It was the heavy, lumbering groan of a loaded buckboard. Silas slowly stood up. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag. Coming over the ridge, cutting through the heat haze, was a battered wooden wagon. Clara was driving. The 7 children were in the back. James sat beside her on the bench, holding a rifle across his knees. Not aiming it, just holding it, protecting his family. Silas felt his heart hit his ribs, a heavy, solid thud. Clara pulled the wagon into the yard. She pulled back on the reins. The horses stopped near the water trough. She wrapped the leathers around the brake handle. She didn't wait for Silas to come help her down. She stepped off the wagon herself. She wore her faded blue work dress. But she didn't look like a housekeeper. She walked across the yard with the stride of a landowner. Silas walked to meet her halfway. They stopped 3 feet apart. The space between them was charged like the air right before a lightning strike. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out the heavy bank draft. The Fort Worth paper, $800. She didn't hand it to him. She walked over to the chopping block and set it down. She weighed it down with a rusted horseshoe so the wind wouldn't take it. Then she turned back to face him. "I got your note," Clara said. "I see that," Silas replied. His voice was rough, dry. "I'm not coming back to scrub your floors, Silas," she said. Her chin was up. Her eyes were locked onto his. "I didn't ask you to," he said. "This money," Clara pointed to the block, "it's not charity. It's not an apology for William. I won't pay for his sins." "Then what is it?" Silas asked. He stepped closer. "It's an investment," Clara said fiercely. "I am buying 50% of the Broken Spur. Equal share, equal say, equal work." Silas looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. Male pride, bred deep into the bones of every man on the frontier, flared up for a second. The instinct to refuse. The instinct to say he didn't need a woman's money to save his skin. He opened his mouth. Clara stepped right up to him. She didn't let him speak. "Don't do it," she warned, her voice dropping low. "Don't you dare let your pride ruin this." True compassion isn't handing out pity, Silas. It's justice. You reached out and saved my family when we were desperate in that square. You didn't ask for anything. Now it's my turn to invest in your worth. She took a breath. The fire in her eyes didn't dim. "We stand as equals," Clara said. "Or I put my children back on that wagon and I keep driving." Silas looked at her. He saw the mud they had fought in together. He saw the freezing rain. He saw the long nights. He saw a partner. The foolish pride burned away, leaving nothing but profound, staggering respect. He reached out. He picked up the bank draft. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket right over his heart. "Equal share," Silas agreed. His voice was a low rumble. "Equal say." Before another word could be spoken, the fast, slick sound of buggy wheels cut through the air. Thaddeus Blackwood rolled into the yard. He wore a dark suit, untouched by the dust. He climbed down from his buggy, a leather satchel in his hand. He looked at Silas. He looked at Clara. He smiled a tight, professional smile. "Morning, Silas. Mrs. Montgomery." Thaddeus said smoothly. He opened his satchel. I assume you're packed, Silas. I have the foreclosure papers ready. I can give you till sundown to vacate the premises. Silas didn't move. He stood his ground. Clara stepped up right beside him. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. A united front. Put the papers away, Thaddeus, Silas said. The deist frowned. Silas, don't make this difficult. The sheriff is just down the road. You missed your payment. The bank is calling the note. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the bank draft. He held it out between two fingers. The debt is $2,400 plus interest, Silas said clearly. That paper there is for $800, drawn on Fort Worth. Clean money. Thaddeus narrowed his eyes. He took the paper. He inspected it. He looked shocked. This is a partial payment. A large one, yes, but it doesn't clear the deed. No, Clara said, stepping forward. It clears the back interest and pays the principal down to a manageable note. According to banking law, a deposit of more than 30% of the outstanding debt requires a mandatory restructuring of the loan terms. You can't foreclose. Thaddeus stared at her. His jaw tightened. He knew she was right. A banker hated nothing more than someone who knew the rules to their game. Where did you get this? Thaddeus demanded, looking between them. That's none of your damn business, Silas growled, taking a protective half-step forward. You have your money. Now restructure the note. We'll be at the bank on Monday to sign the new terms. Get off my land. Thaddeus looked at the draft. He looked at the two hard, unyielding people standing in front of him. There was no weakness to exploit here anymore. The crack in the armor had been sealed. He shoved the paper into his satchel. He snapped it shut. Monday morning, 9 sharp, Thaddeus clipped. He climbed back into his buggy, whipped the horse, and drove away in a cloud of angry dust. The yard fell quiet again. Just the sound of the wind through the dry grass. Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Silas. The heavy, crushing weight that had been sitting on Silas' chest for 6 years was gone. He took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. We need to buy breeding cattle, Clara said, matter-of-factly, breaking the silence. Shorthorns. They survive the heat better. Silas let out a sudden, rough laugh. It startled the horses. It startled him. Shorthorns it is, partner, Silas said. He didn't grab her. He didn't kiss her. There would be time for that later. Right now, there was work to do. And for the first time in a very long time, Silas Vance wasn't doing it alone. July came to the broken spur with a heavy, unblinking heat. It baked the mud into dust. It turned the sky a blinding white. The creek ran high, and the new shorthorn cattle grazed by the water, their red coats shining in the sun. The ranch was alive. It wasn't just surviving, it was breathing. Early morning was the only quiet time, the only cool time. Silas stood in the kitchen before the sun broke over the eastern ridge. He wore his faded denim trousers and a white cotton shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He struck a match. He lit the stove. The routine was the same as it had been for 6 years, but the man was different. The silence in the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full. He took the tin canister down from the shelf. He measured out the coffee grounds. He listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the boys sleeping in the back room. He set 2 heavy ceramic mugs on the wooden table. He heard the floorboards creak in the hall. Soft footsteps. Clara walked into the kitchen. She wore a simple cotton dress. Her hair was pulled back, but a few loose strands framed her face. She looked tired. It was a good kind of tired, the kind you earn from building something of your own. She walked toward the stove. Habit told her to take the pot. Habit told her to serve him. Silas put his hand out. He stopped her gently. He lifted the heavy iron pot himself. He poured the dark, steaming coffee into the first mug, then the second. He set the pot down. He looked at her. "Don't be a housekeeper anymore," Silas said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a proposal wrapped in fancy poetry. It was just a fact. Clara looked at the two mugs. She looked at the calloused hand resting on the table next to them. She didn't cry. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. That wasn't who they were. The frontier had burned the frivolous romance out of them a long time ago, leaving something much stronger in its place. She reached out. She wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic of her mug. She didn't take it to the stove. She didn't sit across from him at the far end of the table. Across was for guests. Across was for strangers. She pulled out the chair directly next to his. She sat down beside him. They drank their coffee in silence, watching the sun come up through the kitchen window. The light hit the table. It warmed their hands. They sat shoulder to shoulder, partners, equals. A quiet, profound commitment sealed without a single unnecessary word. A few weeks later, the heat finally broke. Late August brought a cool breeze from the north. Silas was inside the house, working in the parlor. The storm back in May hadn't just damaged the barn. It had cracked the plaster on the west-facing wall. It needed to be torn out and reboarded before winter. He had his crowbar. He was prying the old pine boards loose. Creak, snap. Dust filled the air. Silas coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. He reached into the dark cavity between the wooden studs to clear out a bird's nest. His fingers brushed against cold metal. He stopped. He reached deeper. It was a small box, heavy, wedged tight against the crossbeam. Silas pulled it out into the light. It was a tin lockbox, rusted dark brown. The hinges were fused with age. It looked like it had been sitting in the wall for decades. He carried it to the dining table. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver and pried the latch open. The rusted metal gave way with a sharp crack. Inside, there was no money, no gold. Just a small stack of letters wrapped in a piece of oiled leather to keep the damp out. Silas unfolded the leather. The paper was stiff, yellowed at the edges. He opened the top letter. The ink was faded, but the bold, sweeping handwriting was still legible. The date at the top read, October 12, 1849. Nearly 30 years ago. Silas looked at the signature at the bottom. James Montgomery, William's great-grandfather, the man who had first broken this dirt, the man who had built this very house. "Clara," Silas called out. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the house. She came in from the porch, wiping her hands on a rag. She saw the rusted box on the table. She saw the old paper in Silas's hands. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. "I found it in the wall," Silas said. "It's from the first Montgomery." Clara stopped. The name still carried a ghost. A slight shadow fell over her face. Silas held the letter out to her. "Read it." She hesitated, then took the brittle paper. She stood beside him, holding it up to the afternoon light. She began to read aloud. Her voice was soft at first, then steadied as she read the words of a dead man speaking to the future. "To whoever finds this box," Clara read, "my name is James Montgomery. My wife Eleanor and I drove our wagon onto this dirt in the spring of '48. There was nothing here but sage and rattlesnakes. We built this house with our bare hands. We buried our firstborn son under the oak tree by the creek." Clara paused. She swallowed hard. Silas placed a hand gently on her lower back. A silent anchor. She kept reading. "We survived the droughts. We survived the winters. But a man's luck only stretches so far. The banks in the east are calling their notes. We are losing the land. Tomorrow, we pack the wagon and head back toward the settlements. We leave with empty pockets." She stopped again. Her eyes scanned the next paragraph. When she spoke, her voice trembled, thick with emotion. But I leave this letter in the walls of the house we built to say this. This land was loved deeply. We poured our youth, our sweat, and our hearts into this soil. That doesn't disappear just because the ones who loved it are gone. A man's failure doesn't curse the ground. Only his bitterness does. Clara looked up. She looked at Silas. If you find this, she read the final lines, her voice clear and ringing with quiet power. Do not pity us. Build upon our foundation. Take this dirt and make it yield. Honor the sweat of the past by making a future. The land remembers the love. It is yours now. Make it a good home. Clara slowly lowered the letter. The room was perfectly still. The ghost of William Montgomery, the betrayal, the lies, the stolen money shattered into 1,000 pieces and blew away like dust. William hadn't tainted the land. He had just been a weak man trying to reclaim a strong man's legacy the wrong way. He didn't leave a curse, Clara whispered, staring at the faded signature. He left a blessing. Silas looked around the parlor. He looked at the floorboards he had walked on for 6 lonely years. He looked at the walls he had punched in anger. The land wasn't a trap. It was an inheritance, passed from a man who loved it, to a man who had bled for it, and finally, to the woman who would heal it. It's a good home, Silas said quietly. Clara smiled, a real deep smile that reached her eyes. She carefully folded the letter back into the oiled leather. She placed it gently back into the rusted tin box. She walked over to the open cavity in the wall. She set the box right back on the crossbeam, where it had rested for 30 years. Leave it, Clara said, for the next ones. Silas picked up a fresh pine board. He set it over the gap. He drove a nail into the wood, sealing the past inside the walls. A foundation to build on. September came with a cool morning mist. It hung low over the pastures, clinging to the tall grass. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Silas stood at the edge of the south pasture. The wooden fence posts were rotting at the base. They needed to be replaced. Wire needed to be strung. It was the exact same job he had been doing that freezing April morning when this whole story began. He wore his heavy leather gloves. He held the iron stretchers in his hand. He looked at the barbed wire, but it wasn't the same. Pull it tight, James, Silas said. 16-year-old James stood 10 feet away. He wore a canvas coat and heavy boots. His shoulders were broader than they had been in the spring. He had stopped looking at the ground. He looked at the wire. James gripped the heavy wooden lever. He threw his weight backward, straining against the heavy steel wire. Got it? James grunted. Silas stepped in quickly. He drove the U-shaped staple deep into the wooden post with 2 sharp blows of his hammer. The wire hummed, taut as a guitar string. Good man, Silas said. James beamed. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He didn't puff out his chest. He just nodded and moved to the next post, ready for the work. He was learning how to be a man, not by being broken, but by being built. Suddenly, a high-pitched squeal cut through the morning air. Faster, Silas! Faster! Silas reached up with his gloved hands. He gripped the tiny booted ankles, dangling over his collarbones. Grace was sitting on his shoulders. She had one hand, tangled in Silas's thick hair, the other pointing forward like a cavalry commander. Hold on tight, little bird, Silas chuckled. He broke into a heavy jog down the fence line. Grace squealed with pure, unfiltered joy. Her laughter bounced off the open plains. Silas felt the weight of her on his shoulders. 30 pounds of warm, breathing life. 6 months ago, he would have thought this weight was a burden. He would have thought needing someone, or having someone need him, was a weakness. A crack in his armor that the world would use to tear him down. He had been wrong. A solitary man is just a stick in the wind, easy to snap, easy to blow away. It was the roots that made you strong. It was the weight of other people, the shared mud, the shared storms, the shared coffee in the quiet morning that anchored you to the earth. He wasn't a solitary cowboy, roaring at a cruel town anymore. He was the anchor of a family, and that made him invincible. Silas slowed to a walk. He was breathing hard, smiling. He turned and looked back toward the house. The mist was clearing. The sun was burning bright and golden on the tin roof of the porch. Clara stood on the top step. She had a woven basket under her arm. She was watching them. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She just stood there, strong, steady, the heart of the broken spur. Silas met her eyes across the distance of the yard. He tipped his hat, just a fraction of an inch. Clara smiled. Silas turned back to the fence line. He shifted Grace securely on his shoulders. He picked up his hammer. There was a lot of daylight left, and there was work to do. The author does not encourage or promote dangerous actions, illegal behavior, discrimination, or harmful conduct depicted in this story. Any conflicts, confrontations, or controversial themes shown are fictional elements designed to support the dramatic structure of the narrative.
And so the fence was mended, not just the split rail posts at the edge of the south pasture, but the deeper, invisible fence that a man builds around his heart when the world has beaten him down long enough. Silas Vance had spent 6 years confusing solitude with strength. He had convinced himself that needing no one was the same as being invincible. He had confused the weight of loneliness with the weight of integrity. And then a woman arrived in his yard with 7 hungry children, flour-dusted hands, and a secret so heavy it could have crushed them both. And she chose, against every instinct of self-preservation, to spend it on honest work instead of easy salvation. That choice, that single, quiet act of moral stubbornness, is the beating heart of this story. The first truth this story presses into us is the difference between charity and dignity. When Silas stepped off that wagon in the town square and boomed his righteous anger at the God-fearing crowd who stepped around 7 freezing children like they were mud on the boardwalk, he didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because the sight of a 3-year-old's teeth chattering in the cold while grown adults clutched their coat collars and looked at the sky was simply unbearable to a man who still had a functioning conscience. That was the easy part. What came after was the harder lesson. He gave them a roof, yes. He gave them food, yes. But the real gift was the way he gave it. He told James the boy wasn't useless when he dropped the farrier's rasp. He carried little Grace on his shoulders until her laughter rang out over the open plains. He ate the same food from the same pot at the same table as the people working under his roof, and he sat at the small table, not the big one. Every one of those choices said the same thing without a word of ceremony. You are not less. Poverty is not a character flaw. The sweat of a desperate person is worth the same as the sweat of a comfortable one. And a man who forgets that has forgotten something essential about what it means to be human. The second truth belongs to Clara. She arrived with a lie of omission, a hidden fortune, and a burning need to square a debt that wasn't even hers to carry. She worked for $4 a month on the land her husband had stolen to reclaim. She scrubbed floors so that her own conscience would be clean, not so that the books would balance. When Silas finally discovered the bank draft and the ancestral deed, when the cold, suspicious anger returned to his eyes, and he looked at her like she was just another chapter in William Montgomery's long book of betrayals, Clara didn't beg his forgiveness. She didn't cry or collapse or offer a bargain. She looked him in the eye, told him exactly why she had come and exactly why she had to leave, and then she called for her son to hitch the horses. Because she understood something that most of us take decades to learn. A relationship built on one person's pity and the other person's gratitude is not a partnership. It is a transaction. And a woman who has already lived as a man's legal property has earned the absolute right to refuse any arrangement that looks even faintly like a cage, no matter how kindly it is offered. She came back, in the end, not because she needed rescuing. She came back because she had done the hard arithmetic of her own soul and decided that this man, this particular, difficult, proud, genuinely decent man was worth investing in. 50% equal share, equal say, no exceptions. The third truth is the one sealed inside the walls of the house itself. In that rusted tin box and the faded handwriting of James Montgomery, the man who first loved this dirt before banks and betrayals and bad luck got hold of it. A man's failure doesn't curse the ground. Only his bitterness does. Those words cut through everything. Through William's deception, through Silas's 6 years of solitary penance, through every foreclosure notice and every patronizing visit from Thaddeus Blackwood with his clean suit and his predatory patience. The land was not cursed. The land was loved. It had been loved by a man and a woman who buried a child under an oak tree and still showed up to plow the next morning. It had been loved by a man who drove nails into fresh pine with a broken heart and called it a roof. It had been loved by a woman who chose hunger over compromise and dignity over comfort. The land held all of that love, layered in the soil like rings in a tree trunk, waiting for the right people to come along and feel it under their boots.